This is Talking Hardcore, the podcast for people who love hardcore history.
You study history because it allows us to understand the present and prepare for the future.
Yeah, it's like Shakespeare or Greek tragedy.
Could you imagine what was in the Library of Alexandria?
I bet it was porn.
I'm not even wearing pants right now, Scott.
What's the old Clint Eastwood line? A man's got to know his limitations. I know my limitations.
The Talking Hardcore podcast is presented by Ace Industrial Solutions. Are you in need of skilled trade professionals for your next project? Look no further.
This is Talking Hardcore. I'm George.
I'm Scott.
And we're here today with Stephen Warren. Steve, you want to tell us your credentials real quick before we jump into the podcast?
Yeah, sure. I'm a professor of history and American studies at the University of Iowa.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us. We first found out about Steve when he co-hosted a live show in Salt Lake City with Dan Carlin. He was the presenter who got to question Dan before they turned it over to the audience. And Scott and I were there, and we thought it was awesome. Steve, you did a great job. It can't be easy. Dan is, as he says, addicted to context. So corralling that sometimes might feel like herding cats, especially with his fans there because they're kind of similar. I know I am. So,
well, I'd have to ask: would you consider Dan Carlin as like the rock star of history, or more something like the bad boy?
How do historians like yourself think about people like Dan Carlin, especially Dan Carlin? Like, do you think of it as a good thing, a bad thing? What do you think?
Yeah, of course. I mean, so full disclosure, I got a call on a Monday saying, would you like to moderate a show with Dan Carlin? And at that time, I had not heard of him. And so I had no familiarity at all with his podcast. Although, funny story, I have a really close friend who did mention him several years before as someone he really listens to. And so one of the fun things about being asked to be on the show was over the course of the week, as I familiarized myself with him and his work, all of these people who I love and respect and admire started saying, you get to talk to Dan Carlin? and so by the time Saturday rolled around, I was very familiar with the magnitude of the person, I was speaking with, scheduled to speak with. And, I'm really impressed by Dan and his work. I think it's excellent.
Well, yeah, we obviously
same as well. Yeah, same here.
I thought you did a really good job.
I would imagine. I would imagine you do as well. Yeah.
Right. Well,
but I mean, people like Dan, serve a really important purpose. And there are a lot of, I'm a big fan of, I'm a reader, I read typically and not really listen to podcasts as much, although, I think the medium is really appropriate to our time, and I've tried to make the transition. But anyway, as a reader, I read histories written by journalists and people who are not academically trained historians all the time. So, of course, there's a place for those folk.
Yeah, I agree. And it's almost like carrying – you kind of look at Dan Carlin and history podcasts like The Rest is History and Tom Holland and those guys.
Andre Vallely.
Yeah, Daniele Vallely.
Daniele Vallely.
You kind of look at them as carrying on the oral history tradition. They're not practicing history like you do, right? They're not discovering history. They're making it palatable and relatable and telling the story, like Herodotus did, and like people throughout history. So you need both, right? You kind of need both.
Yeah, I think so too.
Okay, and so your focus. Oh, good. Your focus is in Native American studies.
Yeah, that's correct. So, got my PhD back in 2000 from Indiana University, and have just been reading and writing about Native Americans, mainly from the Great Lakes, ever since. And one of the things that I focus on is on, sort of repairing the damage done by Indian removal, which is, America's experiment with ethnic cleansing in the states that I've lived in, from Ohio to Indiana to Iowa now, Illinois, for example, Michigan, Wisconsin. So in that area of the world, I look at Native people and government policies, toward them,
and trying to claw back some of their culture. Is that kind of part of what you're doing?
Yeah, I don't think that's certainly not a task that's way beyond my pay grade. But there are, speaking of storytelling, and other important sites of storytelling are museums. And so across these states, there are local museums, state museums that are trying to do a better job of interpretation. And so sometimes I talk with those folks about maybe how to integrate indigenous perspectives into their material. So that kind of thing. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Just trying to complete the story, tell the whole story.
Well, and just so you know, we're in the Great Lakes region, so we're in Michigan.
Yep. So everything around here is named after. Yeah. Everything around us is named after Native Americans and
Shiawassee.
Of course.
You kind of grow up with that, like I'm sure you did. If you said it was Ohio, it's very similar, right?
Yeah, I think there were. I think there are 12 federally recognized Native nations in Michigan. So yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah, I mean, I went to college in Central Michigan University, and the tribe there, and they're tied in with the college, and you do a lot with that there too. It's a fascinating history.
So I got to ask you all a question. I was just listening to your interview with Dan on your podcast, and you all threw some shade at your history professors. So to open up.
Yeah.
Well, so what is it that we history professors do wrong? Well,
let me answer, since it was me that.
Okay, fair enough. Go ahead.
It's not every history professor, right? Yeah. It's just you remember the bad ones and you remember the really good ones, right? Yeah. That's kind of how teaching is, right? But I think there's a disconnect when teaching history if you focus too much on testable things. And it was worse in high school than it was in college. But I remember specific professors that their main focus was just simply on not the interesting stuff, which is difficult then, because then if you're not training to go out to dig sites and you're not training for deep depth history studies, you're going to tune out. At least some people do. And that's why somebody like Dan really works better for me to learn, because I like the big picture. I don't need the minutia. I just need to see how everything flows together and how it relates. And that helps me see how humans are and helps me understand better what's going on today. So that's what I like about history, is learning about human nature. Okay. But if we're focusing on this type of pottery and this in this century in this region, which I said this in that podcast, but I'll say it again. I had a class that was Near East to Alexandria. Okay. Think about how interesting that should be. Okay. Yeah. And this guy, 8:30 in the morning, is just sewing slides every day of his dig sites. Didn't learn anything about any of the big people, the big players, or any of that. And it was like, it was so atrociously boring that I would fall asleep. And I love history. That was, and I was also 19. So there's a little bit of that too. There's a little bit of my fault on that. I'm not blaming it all on the professors. Some of it is me.
Well, to kind of expand on that, I would say that, it's funny, like I go straight to history in high school, right? So it was names, dates, this is what you need to know, and it was like an assembly line, like here's, 1776, the founding fathers, and then this battle, this battle, this battle, this battle, but nothing, no details about why it was interesting or why it was important. It was just, well, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. And it was like
Right.
an assembly line of memorization. And if you,
That's
Right.
so they could test you for it.
I understand, yeah, it was for testing purposes, but that's the problem.
Yeah.
If you, like,
Right.
I could read a textbook and I can answer a question in a blue book, no problem.
Right.
It's and then when you're answering your blue book, you kind of like deviate into little details that you read or you picked up, or even stuff you didn't even find in the book that came from the lecture. But something like, if we need to turn, or at least, and I think this is why Dan is so successful, is he takes history and he puts kind of like a personal flavor into it, or he makes it's more in.
No, you're right. You hit it.
Yeah.
He keeps the drama. He keeps the people.
But it's the same thing like reading Shakespeare, right? Nobody likes reading Shakespeare unless you're really into Shakespeare. But until, like, if you had male students in a Shakespeare class, as soon as they figure out it's all about sword fighting and sex and whatever, and parties, then they could relate. So, but I mean, you have to relay that to them, like, oh, they went to this party. No, you have to be like, oh, it was like the Great Gatsby, huge party.
Right.
You know, people dressed up in masquerade. You know, anyway.
But when you're teaching a class, I'm sure you probably. I mean, what do you focus on when you're teaching a class? How do you teach Native American studies?
Yeah, I think that a key to success is connecting past and present. And, you know, too often in a history class, it all seems safely historical, you know, and I think if you're a young person, you really need to see and understand that it's relevant to how you're living right now, in order to have a kind of a sense of connection to it. And so I think in Native American studies, that's pretty easy, right? Because, you know, all of these historic events are still very tangible, you know, in the lives of Native Americans. And so, you know, you can make that case. I think that in Dan's podcast, it's interesting to think about, you know, a theme like the rise and fall of empires. You know, so even if you're talking about like Alexandria, you know, you know, or Charlemagne, you as an American become invested in it because you're thinking the same thing about the United States, right? Like, what's the clock on our empire, you know, for example? And it's a kind of a timeless theme, right?
Yeah. And I think you hit the nail on the head. That's when it's real. And the good teachers and the good professors, they do that. And there's also this classic Western education where we study the classics, you know, and study Rome and study all that stuff, and that gives us a common understanding that we can all talk to each other, and I think that is important, and we don't necessarily do that enough, and I worry about that. Like if we're focusing on, we need to have a common language to understand. And I remember this brings me something that you said in the podcast or in the show with Dan, that you had a book that you were trying to get published, but there was too triggering. I'm trying to remember the exact details.
Yeah. I didn't tell. I tried to shorthand the story because, you know, the show was about Dan and for Dan, and people came to hear Dan. So
well,
they
you
didn't
tell
need
us
to
now.
hear.
Yeah, you tell us now. I'd love to have
publishing
it.
Story, but one of the things that I think we should talk about is violence, because violence is a pretty central part of Dan's podcasts, whether that's 25 hours on World War I, you know, or a podcast series on torture, you know, for example.
That one was tough.
And
that one was tough.
Well, that brings up a question.
Let it finish.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, but so tell us the story. Tell us the story, if you could.
So the story is that I opened an article. I opened an article about Native Americans in Indiana with a massacre of Native people who were just hanging out tapping maple sugar trees as anyone would in March when some settlers happened upon them and, murdered them all in the most brutal possible way. And the article is very descriptive about it. And I went, I made the point that for these Native Americans, one of the reasons why they were vulnerable to violence like that is because they weren't citizens of the United States. And so they didn't have any constitutional or legal status. And it was a rare instance where some of the perpetrators were prosecuted, but the majority of them got off, because of this citizenship issue. And so, the violence had a point. And I think in Dan's podcasts, the violence has a point. But the audience, the journal didn't want that, because they thought it would be too upsetting to readers, to read what happened to this family.
Well, and that's what's fascinating to me. And George and I talked about this. We had a follow-up podcast after watching the show with you and Dan live. How is it that, like Dan brought up the example of he watched the previews for a movie and there was 140 deaths in 3 minutes or whatever, simulated deaths in 3 minutes. How is it possible that people are more sensitive to written word about an actual thing happening than watching 140 simulated deaths in 3 minutes? Like I just don't. It blows me away, and it's the same thing with. I wanted to ask this question. Well, this is one of two questions I would have asked during that show. How is it that we have, American students watching that much violence or simulated violence, but yet they're so sensitive to, they get triggered at things that, they're not triggered against violence or acts of violence or deaths on TV or anything like that. But then, if you bring it to them in real life, then it's all of a sudden an issue.
Well, and I think, to me, it's exactly the reason why we need to talk about it and why you wrote the article is because that really happened.
Yeah.
The Avengers or John Wick, those didn't really happen. So it's not going to be as upsetting. But that's the reason you need to read it. And that's the reason you need to know about it. Because we're humans. Violence is built in the world. Violence is built into the world. It's in nature. Every species deals with violence. Every animal species, every plant species, everything
Insect,
deals
whatever.
with violence. It's part of nature. And we need to deal with that aspect of humanity. And if we pretend like it didn't happen, we're doing a disservice to us, and we're also doing damage to our I think we're making something dangerous there if we have a generation of kids who don't understand what humans are capable of.
Yeah, I would just I would amend, my share in Salt Lake City on one point that I think it has merit to our conversation here, which is that, it's also true that students on the right of the political spectrum don't want to hear about like the enslavement of human beings as chattel in the United States, right? That is considered upsetting to them as well. And if there's one kind of through line to Dan's histories, it's that he tends to tackle difficult histories that are really, violent and important military events. And so, they're hard to listen to, but they're also essential listening in many ways.
Right.
And so I think, students from the left and from the right feel triggered by history today, but for maybe different reasons. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I have one thing that I didn't know up until recently is, and maybe you can confirm this, as to the point of slavery. Now, I read a report that I think it was between 1% and 3% of Americans held slaves. But in a history class, I don't know if that's accurate. I don't know. I'd have to confirm that. But I think it was between 1% and 3%, and it was mostly upper class plantation owners. But having said that, if that's accurate, when I read a book, or when historically when I was told about slavery, or whatever previously when I was told about slavery, it sounded like every citizen had slaves, but that's not how it's portrayed. So, I mean, I think that you might get it might be more palatable if there was actually like maybe a percentage, maybe 1 or 3%, 1 to 3% of Americans held slaves. I mean, that would be palatable to the left. I mean, whatever that percentage is.
No, but I think you raise a good point though, Steve, and it's not just one side of the political spectrum that is being sensitive.
For sure.
And it's like when you talked about the massacre that you wrote about, we know those happened, but it's still hard to hear because even if we try not to, we still relate more with the settlers than we do with the natives, even though they're all long gone and they were all part of what ended up making America. So as Americans, we should relate just as much to the Native Americans as to the settlers. That's the way I look at it, because our whole culture, everything about America is formed based on the interactions between Native American tribes and the settlers, the good and the bad. All of that is what helped make this country, and so we should treat the Native Americans and the settlers as our ancestors. So it's upsetting to hear, but it's still necessary to hear it, no matter which side you're on. And then it shouldn't be a side thing. History shouldn't be a left or right thing, right? We shouldn't be studying history from a left or right perspective. We should be studying history, and then if you have your political views and he has his political views, or they have their political views, fine, great. Your view should be more informed if you have a more thorough knowledge of history. That's the way it seems to me.
Yeah. I think of course, I agree with you. And in the classes I teach, I frequently tell students that, there are a variety of really good arguments that you can make about any given subject. There are also hundreds of really bad ones that you can make. And, and the way you discern the way you discern the difference, between a good argument and a bad one is your evidence. And so, you don't have to make an argument that I agree with. But what you do have to do is demonstrate a command of the evidence and be able to corroborate your points. And so, I don't think that only 1 to 3% of Americans owned other humans. We'd have to talk about when that was.
Can I clarify real quick?
Sure.
It was a census.
I had to put on my history hat,
No, for sure. I just looked up that particular article. It was a census of 1860, so it's at 1.6% of people in the census owned slaves.
But I mean, it would have been higher if you were just taking the South.
Correct. Or
there was a lot of poor people that had just came over from Ireland, and so that could tip the scales. But even then, at the time, there was 10 million slaves?
I don't know.
And there was something like 40 million Southerners. So I think I just listened to this on a Civil War podcast, but the South was I think at 20% or something like that slaves, population wise. But a vast majority of those were owned by a small minority of people. But that doesn't make it better because they were still participating in that culture, right? They were still.
That's what I was going to say is that I think the percentage was going down in the American South, and I think it hovered around 24%, and the vast majority of those enslaved were on big, plantations of 20 or more people were enslaved, but people still continued to have house slaves and 1 or 2 people.
Right.
There was a fellow in Kansas who I've been studying, and who, owned 8 people, most of whom were children, who just worked on his farm.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, to me, like, there's always a danger with quantitative evidence.
For sure.
The three of us are,
Yep.
we don't have our facts in front of us, and so
Yep.
we're kind of in danger.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think one thing that fascinates me about the South is just the level of commitment among Southerners to the institution, whether they own people or not, explains the power of the Confederacy.
Well, and not only whether they own people or not, whether they were benefiting from that practice.
Yes, yeah.
Many of those poor Southern people were actually hurt by the practice of slavery. It was not good for them either. Okay, it did not help them economically at all. Right? If there was a fair labor market,
yet they fought and died for it
because it became a tribal thing. Yeah. It became a tribal thing, and when it's at least I'm above those people. Even if I'm dirt poor, at least I'm not at the bottom. And this humans fight for status. I mean, chimps fight for status. Like, that's a primate thing.
Well, and what's interesting is I'm just recalling this from a history class I took. I think I might have been high school or college, but it was up until it was Revolutionary War to the Civil War, to the end of the Civil War. And how it was explained at that time was the North had started garnering, so the South pretty much ran the country, or they had the most money because of all the agriculture. So cotton was a big cash crop, tobacco. Sugar was another one, but not so much sugar, mostly cotton and tobacco. And then as the North started industrialization and started garnering, having more money, more production, more power within government, the South was losing that control. And at the same time, the British started buying their cotton from Egypt, which really hurt the South. And then the push for, there was the fifth.
No, it was when Britain started pushing against the.
I was talking about the 3/5. Was it 3/5 Act?
Well, the 3/5 compromise was in the Constitution.
And then, and then you had the North actually trying to abolish slavery, which would have really put the nail in the coffin for the South's power hold in government. And that's what was one of the reasons, one of the main reasons for the cause of the Civil War. I'm just regurgitating something from like 20 years ago, so please forgive me.
But I would like to get it back to Native Americans.
Yeah, sorry about
because
that.
I've got an expert here, and this is something I think about a lot, and I want to pick your brain about. Sure. Okay, I remember I never learned in high school or elementary school, never learned in before undergrad, how many Native Americans died from the diseases. Right, I never realized, and then I remember I took a class on Native American history. And I remember when the professor told us it was between 70 and 90%, just being absolutely flabbergasted. And that has never left me. That was 20-some years ago, 25 years ago, and has never left me. And it's what shapes everything about this country, like everything about this whole land. Like if that hadn't happened, the whole interaction with the Native Americans would have been much, much different, right? It would have been completely different. And we wouldn't be America today. It would probably be something completely different, right? We would be something else. Right. And I find that.
Right.
Go ahead. But that's I wanted to pick your brain about that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, and so getting to data again dangerously, there's this thing called historiography that I heard you all talk about with Dan, and there's a big debate about numbers, and and how many people died, and obviously there were no census takers, who did a really good job of assessing, village by village. But yeah, we do actually put the figure closer to 90%. And, it's a staggering genocide caused unintentionally, right? Just by globalization.
Flukes of nature,
virgin soil epidemics, and I don't know if you all have read Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel.
Yes, we have.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, it's a really good book, isn't it? And I think he offers a nice, succinct definition of it that, that a key factor is just the presence and or relative absence of domesticated animals. I was just reading something this morning about how the bird flu has somehow managed to even get into cows, and how it's appearing genetically in cow's milk.
Wow.
That we're drinking.
Wow.
And,
I'm going to have to look that up. That's
so,
crazy.
So, domesticated animals have always been horrendous disease vectors, and that explains a lot of the course of events.
Well, one thing that, let me just, because this is really relevant. One of the newer theories I've heard about this too is that they also think that Native Americans were particularly vulnerable because there was a population bottleneck when they came over from Asia. Mm-hmm. And population bottlenecks tend to give you less genetic diversity, which also makes you more vulnerable to disease. So the theory is that they were particularly more vulnerable to the diseases from the New World than other places that hadn't went through such a bottleneck.
Yeah.
And so that's why it was, instead of 50% or 60%, it was 90%, which is devastating. But anyway, what were you going to say, Scott?
Well, I was going to say, just like the Native Americans with smallpox, you had Europe and the bubonic plague. I just wanted to make that comparison.
Right, so, but you have 50% or 90%. That's the difference.
Yeah, I understand. I get the percentage difference. I'm just saying it was something similar due to globalization, where a disease comes from somewhere else, and like Dan was talking about, bubonic nukes or ghost ships would just show up where everybody's dead on board. And anyway, it's just interesting when you think about things like that, especially when it comes to globalization and disease.
So the spread of that disease, do you know kind of like, do we know as a humans, do we know like how fast or how slow that was?
Yeah, I that's a good question. And, there are a couple of the big disease outbreaks didn't really occur en masse until people started bringing their kids over. So the English, were really into family migration. And, they brought over their children, and those children got sick and contaminated people. I mean, you two have kids, and that as soon as your kids enter school, all bets are off, and kids are really gross, right? I mean, they sneeze and they don't cover their mouths and all the things. Yeah. And so it's not. I mean, people were suffering and dying from the minute Europeans showed up for a variety of factors, including the slave trade. Mm-hmm. And, another piece of evidence that, is that it wasn't simply the virgin soil epidemics, but it was things like, the burgeoning slave trade and warfare and malnutrition. So people become vulnerable, their immunity, breaks down, as they're struggling to feed themselves and their children. And,
right.
And so, some people died without ever even laying their eyes on a European, which is crazy to think about. They had a native person who maybe traded with them 50 miles down a river, carrying with them some kind of contagious disease. So there are all sorts of events, and this is what makes it really hard to get, firm numbers, about who, about how many people passed away, but something that you learn when you read the documents is just how different humanity must have looked, in say 1700, because almost everyone was scarred or wounded or maimed in some way by epidemic disease.
Right. Yeah. Right.
And so, I think about like society today where we really don't have a whole lot of experience on a daily basis with death or with malnutrition, with people being injured. It's one of the privileges of the of our world today, and it was so ever present back in the day.
That's a great point, and you hit the nail on the head with that. We take it for granted. A lot of things that we have we don't even think about. We don't think about how clean everything is. We don't think about showers every day. We don't think about sanitation and not living with dysentery and all of those things that killed more people than smallpox. I think the argument is that dysentery's killed more people than smallpox, right?
Yeah.
Well,
think about like Abraham Lincoln's mother. I mean, the poor woman, drank contaminated milk because the cow went out in the pasture and ate a poisonous plant and ingested it, and then she drank the milk and died.
I didn't know that.
I mean,
that either. Yeah.
So the possibility of dying, was just constant.
Absolutely.
Even among settlers.
Yeah. One of the things that's interesting about that, sorry, I'll let you talk.
No, go ahead.
Is that's kind of the reason I think we have all these autoimmune disorders nowadays as well, is because our immune systems don't have anything to do relatively compared to what they were evolved for, right? Your immune systems used to have to be on high alert all the time. And now it's like, well, what do I do? Well, I'll just attack this. And it's usually you that it's attacking.
Yeah.
Because you're taking showers and using antibacterial soap and all that stuff adds up. So, but anyway, what are you going to say?
Well, it's not like people didn't bathe. They just didn't bathe as often.
Yeah. And they bathed in a river.
Yeah, I gotcha. I understand. But I just think of like, an exponential, when you're talking about, disease spreading, it all starts with like the telegraph game, right? So if you had one person trades with a European settler and that blanket had smallpox or some whatever on it, and then that settler gets smallpox, but he goes 50 miles up a river and trades with this village, and then this village trades something with that. So anyway, so you just have an exponential, growth across the country, and on how fast something like that can happen. I mean, look at COVID. It's a perfect example.
But nowadays things were even faster.
Well, for sure. I'm just saying, I mean, it wouldn't take long. I know it didn't take long to begin with for here because we have so much global travel, but it still wouldn't, maybe it would have slowed it down by a small, like maybe a year or two, but then it took its, toll across the country. But, you have 2, 4, 6, or 2, 4, 8, 16, 32.
And part of the thing I think that makes it harder for people to understand how that could happen nowadays is because we think of the Native Americans as the way they were after. So they were living in a much different lifestyle
and a much smaller.
Right. They weren't in big civilizations and big cities as much, and they weren't as agricultural. They were more. A lot of the tribes that we remember and we know about were all buffalo driven, but that wasn't the case before the disease. Am I wrong there, Steve?
Yeah, I think you're right. And, archaeologists have done research and found that, in the Midwest, at least, roughly 70% of Native people's diets was plant-based.
Right.
So we imagine them as just running around and eating meat and being nomadic, and they actually had a pretty sophisticated diet that was based probably more on gathering than anything else.
Or some agricultural too, right? They were growing some plants in some places.
Also agriculture.
Yeah.
Yeah, agriculture was a huge piece. And, I teach a class called Native American Foods and Foodways. And in there, I think 60% of the world's table vegetables were originally cultivated by Native Americans, whether that's in Mesoamerica or, north of the border. And so we don't give Native people a lot of credit, for the food we eat, whether it's tomatoes or potatoes or,
I was just about to say
corn, beans, tomatoes, potatoes.
Well, I was just about to say
all tomatoes. The good ones.
I mean, something, once again,
all the good ones.
Something that popped out is I remember hearing a story this way back when the European settler, I think it was the Spanish, when the Spanish came to to Mexico, basically. Now Mexico. They wouldn't eat the tomatoes because they thought they associated the color red with poison. This is way outdated.
It wouldn't shock me if that was some of them anyway.
So they wouldn't eat it, and then the Native Americans were eating. They're eating the tomatoes off the vine. They're like, no, this is good. And then the settlers, not the settlers, the conquistadors tried it, and then they were like, oh yeah, this is good. And then it somehow got back to Italy. Back to Europe and then to Italy.
Yeah.
And then there you go. Everybody's eating tomato. They have a whole
think
diet
about now Italy. You tie Italy to the tomato like that. Ireland to the potato, Italy to the tomato, and those are all from North and South America.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
Right.
And I wonder if maybe the plants were a little bit more important to them because they had less domesticated animals, as we were talking about in Guns, Germs, and Seals.
Yeah.
So they had less animal protein they could rely on, so they had to have more varied vegetable.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's definitely true. And people, most native people had to range across millions of acres in order to subsist successfully. And so, a summer garden was only one part of a pretty sophisticated mosaic of food.
I find that kind of history very interesting and very fascinating to learn how hunter-gatherer societies actually did it, because it seems like it's easy, right? But no, like you said, it's very complicated. They had summer gardens. They had winter places they would winter. They knew they could get these animals at that time from that place, and all of these things all tied together. And it's because almost everything they did all day, every day, was to make sure that they were going to be able to procure food. And it's interesting because that is so little of what we think about now.
Yeah,
because calories
Isn't
are
it
so
interesting
cheap.
that we take that for granted?
Well,
yeah.
This goes to something else you said, Steve, is, we're so detached from, I would call it sustenance survival. So, if you want a steak, you got to go butcher the cow. I mean, I've seen, you know what I'm saying? Like,
you got to kill an animal.
And you have to kill an animal to do it. I remember seeing my great grandmother. And my dad asked her what we were having for dinner, and she went to the chicken coop and grabbed 2 chickens and wrung their necks. And I thought, I guess we're having chicken for dinner.
Right.
I was just at a wedding this weekend where all the old guys were telling stories about grandma and the chicken.
Yeah.
Right.
There you go.
Right. Right. And I think we're getting more back to that.
I think
we are
to that scale.
No, not to that scale. But there's starting to be a push to reconnect to your food.
Well,
that's why you have things like Meat Eater, the show and the website, where that's what they focus on, is procuring your own protein, preparing it, feeling connected to it, butchering it yourself, learning that, and there's all over YouTube and all over the internet is people are learning that is part of what makes us human, part of what makes us a living being, is having that connection, and losing that is detrimental.
No. But I'm just saying.
Well, and speaking.
Go ahead. Sorry, Steve. Go ahead.
Yeah, I didn't intend to interrupt you. I apologize.
No worries.
It's the time delay in the thing, but it ties into the question about killing, right? And death. That was also part of life back in the day, because everyone, whether they were settler or indigenous, had to kill things on a regular basis in order to survive. And we're pretty disassociated from that, too. So it's sort of part of the bigger picture I think you're trying to represent.
No,
well,
you're 100%
and
right.
to expand on that, why people had more children, because you didn't know how many children were going to survive into adulthood.
Right. Well,
that's right.
Because of the disease, the nutrition, all of those factors.
Dysentery.
All right. Steve, I want to be respectful of your time. You've already talked to us so long. This has absolutely been
fantastic.
An awesome, one of the most fun interviews we've done. I am hoping you'll be willing to come back, because we're going to do a podcast on the Aztecs here soon.
Really?
Yeah. So the rest is history did a 5-part No, it was 5. I swear it was. It's 5. Well, it doesn't matter. They did a series, and the rest of history is another history podcast like Dan Carlin, but it's Tom Holland, so it's 2 published historians, and they pick a subject and they do 45 minutes an episode on it, and they did starting with Cortez before he gets to Tenochtitlan, or however you say that, right? And they go right up through the death of Cortez and kind of a little bit past that. And we're going to do an episode on that. And I was hoping maybe after we do that, if you'd be willing to come back on and we could talk a little bit of break that down sometime, that would be wonderful, because that whole thing is just a fascinating subject.
Don't forget Inda by Eve Ball.
So we did a book club, a live book club about Inda by Eve Ball. I'm sure you've read that.
Oh.
Dan recommended that when he was on the show as for our next book club event. And it's such a great read. And it is fascinating to hear these stories from the people who lived it or whose parents lived it. And I find it great.
Right.
Yeah. So, but if you would be amenable to coming back on sometime to talk about that stuff, that would be great. And if you've got a historical subject that you want to talk about on here, we'd love to have you on to talk about it, because this has been a great interview. It's been a lot of fun. Yeah. So we thank you very much.
I'm really glad.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Our
Thanks
pleasure.
for coming on.
Here.